Thank you very much, Chairman. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to speak to you today specifically about Britain, which is in Europe, but very much not of Europe. And I was particularly struck by the Pew poll, which we've been hearing about this morning, which said, among other things, which found, among other things, that Britain was the least Islamophobic of all the European nations that were studied. And Britain, nevertheless, was the country where British Muslims hated their host country the most. And I don't think that this is a coincidence. I think these two things are intimately connected. And I think what we're looking at is an interface between the encroachment of militant Islamism in Britain with what I would consider should be called Britain's cultural lobotomy. I'm going to ask the question rhetorically, what do Britons believe? And I will answer it that Britons believe now nothing and everything, thus proving Chesterton's famous dictum that when a man stops believing in God, he will believe in anything. In Britain, most do profess Christianity, as we've heard. Most do profess a belief in God. Nevertheless, the real religion is individualism. Nevertheless, again, there is, as we've just seen, a great desire for spirituality. And what's then therefore happened is that people have gone for spirituality without the church, without organised religion, and without the inconvenience of the moral codes that organised religion has thrown up. Morality has been privatised. What is right as a doctrine has given way to what is right for me, which is the basis of the moral and cultural relativism we've been hearing about, which involves, as you know, no judgment to be permitted of different people's lifestyles. It involves the development of multiculturalism and victim culture based on the doctrine that the values of the majority are by definition illegitimate because they exclude the minorities. There is, under this doctrine, no objective truth. Everything is a matter of opinion because my values are the equal of your values, and therefore it is merely my opinion versus your opinion. There is no objectivity, there is no truth. This has given rise to a moral and social anarchy in which we in Britain are rapidly retreating to a pre-modern age of irrationality, having disaggregated truth. We no longer are able to use the reason that bases itself on truth. This is particularly ironic because in our society, in Britain and in the West, we make a fetish of reason. It is in the name of scientific reason, also known as empiricism, we have exiled religion and declared that God is dead because the biblical stories are merely primitive superstition as they don't correspond to the dictates of reason as defined by scientific empiricism. However, in our age of unparalleled rationality, we in Britain have descended into an unparalleled age of extreme irrationality. People now believe every conceivable wacky and kooky rubbish that is known to the ingenuity of man to invent. We in Britain believe in cults, in paganism, in witchcraft, in psychic phenomena, in reincarnation, in astrology, in parapsychology. David Icke's demented books are selling in their millions, and people believe, as we heard obliquely referred to earlier, that Princess Diana, who herself became a deified figure, was murdered by a conspiracy of MI6 and the Duke of Edinburgh. Now, this complete disintegration of rationality, belief, cultural identity, morality, spirituality, and religion has created a cultural vacuum into which the Islamists, who are certainly not stupid, have recognised this is their opportunity. And Britain, having led the way out of rationality, is their principal target and their principal recruiting ground. The Islamists believe the cultural weakness of Europe, embodied particularly in Britain, and have moved to fill the vacuum. And they've done this in a number of ways. First of all, they are terrorising the population through terror. Secondly, they are converting the most vulnerable in our society, the criminals, the disturbed, mentally disturbed, the young who are looking for a meaning to life beyond materialism and who, for various reasons of a distressing nature to you, no doubt, this is not being filled for them by the churches who have vacated this particular battlefield. The Islamists are also exploiting our victim culture, which has arisen out of our doctrine of multiculturalism, to claim that in the interests of equality, they must have preferential treatment in the public square, backed up by the threat of terrorism. The intellectual elite in Britain has fallen for this hook, line and sinker, unlike the public, who most certainly have not. But our intellectual, political and, I'm afraid, security establishment in large measure is saying, instead of saying that Muslims in Britain must be treated on the principle of equality like any other minority, they have allowed and indeed condoned and encouraged the steady encroachment of Islam into the public sphere. So we now have earnest discussions by our most senior lawyers of the extent to which Islamic law can and should be permitted to encroach into the field of the English common law, although the principles of Islamic law are inimical to the English law and to the canons of Western society and British society. We have the famous lecture by the Archbishop of Canterbury in which he said that we should not be at all concerned or frightened about Sharia law, and that it was entirely proper for British Muslims to have recourse to Sharia family law alongside British English common law. He was somewhat surprised by the reaction that he provoked, which was, to put it mildly, explosive, although not in the literal sense. But what he didn't understand was that what he was so confidently saying we should have no fear of as a hypothetical enticement for the future was already happening in spades. In Britain, we now have the steady development of Muslim enclaves which are governed informally by a parallel jurisdiction of Sharia law, a kind of embryonic state within a state. We already turn an official blind eye to such things as cousin marriage, genital mutilation of women, honour violence and polygamy. Indeed, we are now, as a state, encouraging and condoning polygamy because we are now giving welfare benefits to the multiple wives of Muslim men. Our Prime Minister has said that London should become the global centre of Sharia finance. This is absolutely catastrophic. People in government and in the city can only see one thing: the signs of pounds sterling dancing before their fevered eyes, and there will be trillions of pounds involved in Sharia finance, and a lot of people will make a lot of money from it. What they don't understand is that this will institutionalise Islamism in Britain. For a start, it has come as an unwelcome shock to some of our banks to find that on their Sharia boards, advising them about their Sharia finance arrangements, sit people who are not wholly unassociated with Islamic terrorism and with Al-Qaeda. And this whole thing is based on a bogus argument about interest, on the basis that Sharia prohibits interest. It doesn't. Sharia, as I understand it, permits interest in, would you believe, Saudi Arabia. What Islam prohibits, as I understand it, is not interest but usury. The fiction that Sharia prohibits interest has been invented in order to Islamize the British public space. And what the people who say, oh well, this is of no consequence because it's simply a means of making money for everybody and therefore everybody will be happy, what they don't understand is that if you are a Sharia authority and you are in the business of finance, there is a payback. You get the money in response for which you adhere to Sharia law. And this will Islamize not just Muslims, but increasing numbers of Britons as we as a society are more and more becoming in hoc to that. Now, the British establishment refuses completely to see all this. It refuses to accept that religion is at the heart of the problem. It refuses to accept that what we are facing is an Islamic jihad. It has instead accepted the Muslims' own assertion that what we are facing in terms of terror is nothing whatsoever to do with religion, and if anyone says that Islam is a religion of violence, they'll kill them. The British establishment thinks that by seeking to accommodate this Muslim narrative, as the postmodernists would have it, of encroachment into the public sphere, they will draw the Muslim sting and get the Muslim community in Britain on side. They will draw the sting of the anger against Britain. They will turn jihadists into model citizens, and they will separate the community from Al-Qaeda. They think indeed that the Islamic religion in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood is an antidote to Al-Qaeda, an antidote to terror. They think the Muslim Brotherhood is a counter-radicalization movement. As a result, they are using the Muslim Brotherhood and bringing it into the heart of the British establishment, because they fail to understand that what we are facing is a pincer movement of Islamism being used against our society, not just through terrorism, but also through cultural attack. What we heard from before from Professor Matai's very important point, we're seeing both Leninist Islamism in the form of Al-Qaeda, and we're seeing Gramscian Islamism in the form of Tariq Ramadan and cultural Muslim Brotherhood onslaught, which of course corresponds to and is using the Gramscian onslaught on the basic tenets of Western civilization through such things as the capture of the intelligentsia, the capture of the universities, the capture of the establishment, the capture of the civil service, the destruction of things like family and nation, and the substitution of the values of the excluded and the transgressive for the values of the normal. That is the Gramscian project. It has succeeded in Britain absolutely to the letter, and the Islamists are coming along and Islamizing Gramsci. That's what we have in Britain. The government doesn't see this, so we now have Muslim Brotherhood people at the centre of government advising the government on how to combat Islamist extremism. I have sat in defence establishment seminars where I've seen hard-bitten ho-ho people from the security establishment sitting lapping up Islamists, bamboozling them with a sanitized and highly selective version of Islam. I know that the police are giving sensitive security information to Muslim extremists who are on their liaison groups with the committee, with the community, which are not vetted in case they upset the Muslim community, and they are asking permission of these people before they conduct raids. And what all this is doing, it is undermining the true moderate Muslims in our midst, of whom there are certainly some, not by any means as many as is said to be, but they do exist. And they say with considerable feeling that when the British government brings on and treats as genuine interlocutors the Muslim Brotherhood, what that is doing is cutting the ground from under the feet of the moderates, the true moderates, who then have no ground to stand on. I would conclude by saying this. I was very struck by the address last night of Cardinal Pell, and he painted a relatively benign and indeed optimistic picture of relations between the non-Muslim and Muslim minority in Australia. And I would make 2 points to this, which I don't think he fully acknowledged. The first point is that Australia has very few Muslims compared to what we have in Britain and what there is in Europe, and that of course makes a very considerable difference. But the key thing about Australia also is that, in my view, it is no coincidence that this relatively happy state of affairs follows the incredibly hard line taken by John Howard and other ministers in that government, who basically said in terms repeatedly, this is the line we are drawing. We are a European Western society. You live here on our terms, or else you go. And by the way, we are not letting a lot of you in. And like it or lump it, these are our terms. This is our society. This is our culture. You are welcome to take part in it, but on our terms. And this is what has to happen. We have to draw the cultural line in the sand. The British Muslims say to us, we want equality. We are a minority, we want equality. And the establishment, because it's so bamboozled by multiculturalism, thinks that equality means equality of the minorities with the majority. But it doesn't. The deal since the establishment has been that a majority upholds its own society, in the case of Britain and the West, tenets of liberalism, of tolerance, of the disconnect between religion and the public square, and that all minorities are treated the same as each other within that. In other words, they are all free and welcome to practice communities of faith, but where those faiths may conflict with the dominant values of the majority, those values must give way. We should say to our British Muslims, and the West should say to its Western Muslims, you are welcome to live here, but on our terms, which means that you have the same rights and responsibilities as every other minority. You're welcome to set up your communities of faith, but in terms of this public square, in terms of the public sphere, it's ours, and you do not colonize it. So not 1 inch will we give to Sharia, because we give it to no other minority. Now, in Britain, we have not done that. We have gone hell for leather in the opposite direction, and that is why Britain is the most tolerant nation in Europe towards its Muslim minority, and it is the most hated by that minority. Thank you.